Welcome back to another episode of Policy and Profits. I'm an economist, or at least I play one on TV, EJ Antoni. I'm joined by the one, the only trader extraordinaire, Anthony Esposito of Island Capital Investments. Anthony, how are you doing, sir? How's your week been?
Week has been crazy. Last month has been crazy, but in a good way. We've definitely managed the downside volatility well here. So a little tired, a little stressed, but happy, which is good.
Excellent. Now, speaking of that downside volatility, one thing I've been pretty amazed at this morning was a great example. You know, we get wholesale inflation data with the producer price index. And the number was not horrific. It still wasn't great. It still doesn't point us to the 2% target. We're running way above that at 3% or even higher with core. But one of the things we saw, and we've seen this the last, actually quite a few reports, is the last 4 months were all revised up. So sure, the number might have looked a little bit lower on its surface, but that's because all these previous months keep getting revised higher. So you're growing, but you're growing from a higher rate. In other words, the total level of the index today is still higher than analysts were expecting. And again, that's been true for months. And then I turn and I look at the market reaction and I'm saying, Are people really this dumb? Like, how on earth could the S&P rally on this news in anticipation of, well, inflation was cooler than we thought, so the Fed's more likely to cut rates? It's amazing not only how hyper-dependent the market is on the Fed, but also it's amazing how many market participants don't understand the data on which they're purportedly relying so much. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think from a top-down view, you're 100% right, as usual. The revision, I don't remember revisions like this under any other administration or group of leadership than we see now. We talk about it with the non-farm payroll numbers, which is actually pathetic. And we're talking about it with the PPI, the inflation numbers. So I think that being said, the market's dependency and kind of Fed pivot has been in place now really since 2000 in full effect. The don't fight the Fed theme, the don't fight the Fed mantra has been in place for 25 years now. And it's generally worked, and it's generally worked because somewhat of a kind of snowball effect where people think it's going to work, so it works. And then somewhat of an effect of just creating liquidity in the system and reducing the cost of capital, which produces margin expansion and gives the market the gas to keep going. What I'm concerned with and have been for a while, and now it's like at a fever pitch, is this dependency the market has. It's almost like a relationship with a bad ex-girlfriend. Like you don't want to break up, but you want to break up, but you don't want to break up. So you keep kind of, dipping your toe back in, even though you know it's not the right thing, until there's a complete blow up and there's a rabbit boiling in a pot of water on your stove. And then you're like, oh, you know what? I probably shouldn't have gone back that last time for that last cup of coffee. I think that's the relationship or the spot we're in right now with the Fed. The market is so confused and so enamored with the Fed that it's actually becoming, it's actually, there's going to be the blow up, and the blow up I think we're witnessing right now. Everything that the market does at this point, because there's no other data point to really look at that's positive right now. GDP growth is, in real terms, is negative. Employment numbers are extremely poor, funded by the government, going to the wrong people, and going to, if not directly funded government jobs or indirectly funded government jobs, they're low-paying services jobs, and they're not going to native-born Americans. We know that. So GDP growth is weak. Employment is weak. The consumer is tapped. The housing market is in probably the worst situation overall in my lifetime, where we have high rates, we have high supply, and we have very low opinion of whether it's a good time to buy. I think 84% of those surveyed say it's a bad time to buy.
Right. That's the worst in like 40 years, right?
Absolutely. So we have high prices, we have high supply, we have high rates, and people don't want to buy. So we have a very poor setup, and people are defaulting to the Fed. To the point where we can clearly see that there's an inflationary issue and it's sticky, but they're still talking about buying the market based on the amount of Fed cuts or the dot plot for 2025. It just doesn't matter. And then to go one step further away from this dysfunctional relationship with the Fed cuts 50 bips in September, clearly a political move heading into an election. The previous 250 basis point cuts were COVID and in 2008 during the housing crisis, the credit crisis. So you have 250 basis point cuts, the two previous, in times of massive distress. And then you have a 50 basis point cut while, yeah, things are good, employment's good, inflation's good, we're going to cut 50 bips. So obviously political. The interesting thing is with that 50 basis point cut and two subsequent 25 basis point cuts, we've seen yields spike higher. You actually had a great graphic up on your X account, one of many, where you showed the 20-year yield or the 30-year yield tipping at 20%. The 10-year yield's at 4.75%. I'm actually looking at my sovereign debt monitor now. If we run down the 2 years are at 4.3, the 10s are at 4.79, the 20s are at 5, and the 30s are at 4.98. So we have yields spiking 150 basis points on the 10-year as the Fed cut 100 basis points. Mm-hmm. The whole relationship dysfunctional, my whole rabbit hole analogy done. My question to you is this, and we've been talking about this for 6 months, and now everyone's kind of taking a victory lap as the market's off 6%, saying, yeah, yields are going higher. Well, okay, it already happened. So the train left the station, and you're patting yourselves on the back because you're talking about it. You had a great post, again, on X this week to say, hey, we were way ahead of it, or I think it was Friday. We were way ahead of it. We made the call. Now everyone's catching up. So let's go one step further now and leave the pack behind. And let's talk about why that's happening and explain to me the difference between, and for the audience, because it's crucial, the difference between the Fed funds rate that we keep focusing on and the 10-year yield. Effectively in the economy, in our day-to-day lives, how is that one affecting us? How is the other affecting us? And how do we get this 10-year yield, which is the key? How do we get this 10-year yield down? What does that process look like? And how much pain do we need to go through to get there so that yields, nominal and real yields, come down and we can get back to a normal cost of capital and start to get back on our feet?
So all great questions. Let's start with the Fed portion of that, though. The people think that the Fed just magically sets interest rates and that there's a whole host of different rates that the Fed can simply dictate to the market and say, okay, this is the price of capital in this market. That's really only the case for one major instance. There's a few really small, I would say, rates that they can set in very selective markets, like in repo operations, for example. But if we want to look at big picture stuff, it's the discount window. That's when banks can't get money from each other, when Bank A can't find a loan from Bank B or C or D. And so they go to the Fed, they go to what's called the discount window. The Fed sets that interest rate because you're borrowing directly from the Fed. Okay. But the rate that we talk about the most, that the Fed, quote unquote, sets, they really don't set it. They target a range of rates, and that's the Fed funds rate. Fed funds are what one bank will charge another bank on these typically overnight loans. So the Fed can't dictate to banks, here's what you will charge from one bank to another. So instead, what they do is they try to adjust the amount of liquidity available literally on a daily basis in order to keep the rate of the interest rate on those loans in a very narrow range. That's the Fed funds rate. So when the Fed says we are setting this interest rate 25 bips higher or lower, what they're really saying is we are going to adjust our open market operations. We're going to try to tweak how much liquidity is out there, either add or subtract, in order to move the rate that banks are charging each other up or down. That's all that's happening there. So again, the Fed is not directly setting that interest rate, but they're announcing to the market, here's how we're going to influence things within the market in order to try to push that interest rate up or down. And they actually have a lot of tools at their disposal to pretty tightly control that in the vast majority of circumstances. It's pretty rare that we see things move outside of that range once the Fed makes an announcement like that. But that's very, very different from the yield on treasuries. So the yield on the 10-year is very, very closely watched by the market for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the time horizon there. If you're looking at a 10-year window, you're looking at basically the entirety of a business cycle, right? In any 10-year period, you can usually expect an expansion, a peak, a recession, a trough, and then back to expansion again. So you're going to see essentially the entirety of that business cycle typically. And so it gives businesses a sense of, all right, here's a long run average, at least in the medium term, right? Here's an average over the next business cycle of the kind of risk-free yield I can expect. And then from that, we base a whole host of different market interest rates, including things like mortgages. The 10-year is very influential on a lot of different kinds of consumer credit. So it's good to watch because it can tell you where are interest rates going, whether it's commercial loans, residential loans, industrial, you name it, and also other kinds of government debt, including muni bonds. So the 10-year is a very, very important thing to watch because it can point you to where other interest rates are going to be going. So why on earth is the 10-year continuing to spike? Why is it continuing to climb higher? For exactly what we've been talking about for more than half a year now, which is that the yield is based on the interest rate, right? Those things are obviously very tightly tied to one another. They're not the same thing. But why is the interest rate going up on treasuries? Because the supply and demand is completely out of whack right now. Demand continues going through the roof. The Treasury is continuing to borrow more and more money that they don't have, and the supply is just not keeping up with it. That's especially true because most of the major players around the world right now have become net sellers of treasuries, whether that's China, Japan, the Fed itself. They continue to let the balance sheet roll off. And so the Treasury is looking around trying to find somebody to loan it money. And the only way they can entice more savers to give them more of their savings to lend is to offer higher and higher yields at
so let
these
me interrupt.
auctions.
I'm going to interrupt 1 second. So essentially, what we're saying with the 10-year, let's just focus on the 10-year because I think you're right. I think that's the one we need to look at. Supply is actually through the roof, and demand is fading. So as yields, obviously, price of bonds is inverse to yield. So the lower you pay for a bond with the same coupon, the higher your yield because you're actually buying it lower and getting the same coupon.
Exactly. So right.
We have much more supply than we have demand. The buyers who are there, like everything else, whether it's tomatoes, eggs, cars, or bonds, the buyers are saying, I'll buy it, but you need to pay me more in order to hold this debt, i.e. you need to pay me more in order to lend you money, i.e. I don't believe that I believe I need more in return because the value of these dollars, the real value of those dollars paid to me in fixed terms now, because it's a bond, the real value of those dollars will be lower because inflation is going to be higher through this next cycle. Does that sum up in my, because I'm about a tenth as smart as you, and I'm
no. Anthony, you're spot on. Absolutely, you're 100% spot on. And we can see this when we look at things like the different inflation premia that the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland publishes. I think they do that every month, might be every quarter, but I think it's every month. And we can see that remains extraordinarily high. In fact, it's been climbing for most of the last several months. It's been a little bit erratic, but the trend is still upwards. Okay. So you definitely are seeing more and more inflation risk priced into these treasury markets. Again, something we've talked about for literally months, that we began talking about months ago, and the market is just now finally seeming to catch up to it. And as you said, take a victory lap. And it's like, all right, why are you taking a victory lap on something that's already happened? You're just Monday morning quarterbacking here. Yeah. And look, what we just got data from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which is basically coming out a few days in advance of the official statement from the monthly statements from the Treasury. We just had, between October, November, and December, the worst start to a fiscal year in our nation's history. So that's really troubling when you consider the fact that the fiscal year 2021, which began in October of 2020, right? So that's October, November, and December of 2020. That included a ton of just the blowout COVID spending, right? We're worse than that right now. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. But, You're seeing revenue go down. And by the way, that's another good indicator that the economy is not as strong as we're being led to believe. When the economy is seeing tax revenue go down and not up, that points to a shrinking, not an expanding economy, unless your economy is just nothing but government spending. But I digress. So revenue down, spending up, the deficit's exploding, and all of a sudden Treasury holders are sitting there watching this situation and finally thinking to themselves, you know what? Maybe they're not going to be able to pay off this debt. Or if they do, they're not going to be able to pay it off in dollars that are worth as much as they are today. Yeah. And there's a lot of good indications when we look at the plumbing within the financial system. There's a lot of good indications that that might be the case. We're seeing reverse repo operations at the New York Fed desk. That's almost down to nothing. Once that hits zero, the standing repo facility, as you know, that's going to kick in. And now the Fed is going to go from absorbing liquidity in those overnight operations to instead adding it to the system.
Okay, so I want to pause 1 second. So the reverse repo operations, they add liquidity by buying debt debt securities, let's say debt, and paying dollars out into the system for that. So the reverse repo is where they're actually taking on, they become net buyers of assets and they're pumping money back into the system.
So that's the repo essentially. With the reverse repo, and this is where it gets confusing because the assets that we're talking about are just getting posted as collateral essentially on these loans. So with the reverse repo, financial institutions are parking liquidity at the Fed, and then it just stays there overnight, so it's not available for lending. So that's the key when we say it's absorbing liquidity. At first, it doesn't make sense because the Fed is paying interest on these operations, so they're actually adding liquidity in that sense. But they're only adding a few percentage points off of the literally hundreds of billions of dollars that are getting parked there and not available for lending. But that facility is almost down to zero. Once those operations hit that and the Fed continues rolling off its balance sheet, we're probably going to see then the standing repo facility kick in where the Fed is going to have to do the opposite. In order to keep that Fed funds rate where in that range that we talked about earlier, the Fed is probably going to have to move to start adding liquidity on a daily basis to prevent that rate from going too high. And then once that happens, it's probably not long until the Fed stops the quantitative tightening altogether. This is what we saw basically in the fall of 2019, where the Fed was just over tightening while the economy was growing. It made no sense. But under the Trump administration, they thought there was going to be this runaway inflation, which obviously never happened. And so they were tightening and tightening and tightening. They over tightened the standing repo facility. At the time, it was just the repo desk that had to kick in hard to try to keep interest rates from spiking. And sure enough, once that happened, the Fed said, okay, we're done rolling off the balance sheet. Now we need to go back to buying assets like you're talking about. Look, there's so many problems that are starting to surface, again, in the plumbing of the financial system. And the really crazy thing is, and this is part of the reason why we hate Janet Yellen so much, the really crazy thing is the 10-year, as high as the yield has gotten, it is actually artificially depressed right now because what you were saying earlier, as you increase the issuance of these treasuries, that's increasing demand and you start to see the yield go up. She's actually been keeping the demand artificially low by relying on treasury bills, over-relying, I should say, to finance the debt and the deficit. And so as the incoming Treasury Secretary has to kind of unwind all of that and get rid of a lot of those T-bills, and when they roll over this year, roll them over as 10-year Treasury notes, I mean, the yield's just going to spike even higher.
Yeah, which is a good point. So that's a good lead in. And we went through the distribution of the debt being issued by the government, by the Treasury, by Yellen about 2 weeks ago, which was another great segment that you did and great work you did. It kind of all, and I'll wrap it up here because this is, a lot of times we go through a lot of different topics, but I like the fact that today we kind of focused on this. Fed funds rate, not as day-to-day important to Americans as the 10-year yield, because the 10-year yield, all the details we just went through to the side, is actually much more directly correlated to the interest rate on our mortgage, the interest rate on our credit card, the interest rate we pay on a car loan, the interest rate a small business would pay for materials to get started, for financing on the building. Like all these things are really running off the 10-year yield, and that yield is spiking because of underlying weakness in the economy, because of demand supply issues with bonds, because of inflation expectations. Like it's a basically right now, for lack of a better term, a broken system. And we've been talking about this for months. I've been talking about it outright in my morning note from Island Capital for over 5 weeks now, which led to such a productive P&L in December, which I hate to see, but that's why I was so far ahead of the sell-off, which I was actually positioning for March when we started to see the weakness we saw in December. I didn't expect it that early, but it did come that early. I want to roll into one more thing as we talk about this, because you just touched on it. And then I think we wrap for today, because this is a great conversation and kind of chock full. The unwind you just talked about that needs to happen at the Treasury is going to be part of a bigger undoing of the train wreck that President Trump is going to inherit. And there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but I think the biggest thing, two things you said: the Treasury needing to unwind Janet Yellen's approach to issuing debt and the amount of debt. And then the second thing is the amount of spending that's gone on from the Biden administration. We're spending literally billions of dollars in the last few months of his administration, and he's kind of upticking the pace ahead of Trump coming in on forgiveness of student debt loans, which is clearly not a thing. That money's being allocating money overseas, additional monies to Ukraine, allocating money across the board up and down, except where it counts. If you were going to spend the money helping U.S. citizens and helping the economy here so there's been this complete setup of massive spending, of issuing of debt that doesn't need to be issued or is being issued and then not being utilized. The deficit's basically exploding. The debt is a mess. And Biden's hitting the gas in the last few months. I mean, honestly, objectively, have you ever seen anything like this? And why would a president do that to an incoming president, more importantly, to the citizens of this country, on an unwind of their very, very dismal 4 years? Why would they do this? What's the advantage? What do you think could even be the reason for this hitting the gas on the way out?
Probably the exact same reason that you had so many Democrat governors in 2020 who, despite all the evidence to the contrary, said, we're just going to keep our economies closed the rest of the year. They literally wrecked their own state economies just in an effort to screw Trump, quite frankly. Right. The biggest thing that Trump had going for him in 2020 was the economy. There were lots of reasons why people didn't like the guy, and there's lots of reasons why people still don't like the guy. I get it. But I can't get over how many people I've talked to who last year voted for him despite all of the things that they didn't like about him, because they all said the exact same thing. He told us the economy was going to tank under Biden. It did. My life is demonstrably worse right now. And so I need him to essentially repeat the economic miracle that he provided for us in his first term. And so I think a lot of what Biden, Yellen, even Powell at the Fed, all these clowns are doing is essentially an effort to try to undermine his future success. Again, in the same way that these blue state governors literally tanked their own state economies in an effort to drag down the nation. And sadly, they were largely successful. California played a key role in some of the bad economic numbers, for example, that we got in 2020. And speaking of which, it's absolutely astonishing. You mentioned how we're going to send money overseas to all these nations, some of which aren't even in any kind of distress right now. And so what are we doing here at home? What are we doing to help folks here at home, actual American citizens? How about we spend American taxpayers' dollars on American citizens? I mean, look at what they're trying to do. They're trying to ram through billions upon billions of dollars in so-called aid to California, right? Which is largely just going to go to corporate interests who are going to they're going to build apartment complexes where single family homes used to be in California, firms like BlackRock and whatnot. But what about the fact that we never gave pretty much any money for relief to families in North Carolina who were devastated. What about folks in that part of the country? We gave them like $500. I'm not kidding. It's a sin. It really genuinely is. It makes your blood boil. So because it's a blue state, I guess we're going to spend billions of dollars, and even then, we're not even going to help the actual people who are hurting. Instead, we're just going to use it as an excuse to funnel money to the corporations who pay for the lobbyists that make all the campaign donations.
Yeah, honestly, very well said. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. There's not much more to say. It is a party that is more interested in destroying, demoralizing, prosecuting, and possibly even eliminating the opposition, the political opposition, versus what's doing best for the country. That to me is fascism. That to me is using every tool you have, including intimidation, to get your political way rather than doing what's best for the country. And that, in a nutshell, is why President Trump will be stepping back into the White House in just a few days now, and why Biden and the Dems are losing elections.
Well said.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just following up you. Thank you for the time. Definitely very interesting. We're going to focus on that 10 years still, not only for trading and P&L and the markets, but for day-to-day life. That 10-year yield is what's affecting all of us. So pay attention to that. That's going to be the number. That's going to be one of the indicators that either inflation is being viewed as under control and prices should be coming in and cost of capital should come down, or whether things are going to get worse and pick up. And just to recap really quickly, the Trump administration stepping into a train wreck. And I have I'm obviously not involved, so I can say it and be unbiased. This is an unbiased view. They're getting handed a time bomb. So stepping in, it's going to be messy because it was designed that way. No other man better suited to handle it than Donald J. Trump. So let's see what happens. But it's going to be a mess.
No, Anthony, you're absolutely right. They're getting handed a ticking time bomb. Like you said, it's going to be, it'll be a miracle if they can diffuse it. Now, look, cometh the hour, cometh the man, right? I think Trump is the guy to handle it. He's got a great team around him, especially with, guys like Vance. Vance, I think, did a great job articulating in a recent interview exactly what you just said, that they're being handed this ticking time bomb, and it is going to be hard to diffuse. But look, here's hoping they can really cut the spending and get the economy growing again, because those are the two key things that are going to save us. I think they're the only things at this point that can save us from things getting a whole heck of a lot worse.
I like it. All right, man. Have a great week. Good talking to you. And thank you as always. I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, Anthony. Till next time.